First of all, thanks to all of you for, number one, coming out on a Monday night in not ideal weather, but also that we're going to do this in English. Now, I know that all of you obviously speak English and learned the King's English, proper English. I'm from Florida. I don't speak proper English. I come from the part of the United States that it's sometimes difficult to understand. You're hearing my accent. So I will start off slowly, and so you can calibrate your hearing. It was several months ago that Jop first approached me about coming to this, and I was impressed. First of all, I like it when somebody reaches out early and says, "Hey, would you come speak?" Or "Here we have a program." And it was early enough that we could put it on the calendar and protect it. And then he was relentless about getting the topic right and meeting his expectations. So if tonight is a disaster, it won't be your fault. It'll be totally my fault. My wife and I do love to come to Maastricht, of course. We come every year for the Fine Arts Fair and always enjoy this wonderful city. Now, I was in the infantry for 38 years. I had no idea what TFAF was. My wife said, "No, we're going to TFAF." I'm like, "What is it?" She says, "The European Fine Arts Fair." What? And then we go there, and I'm totally hooked. I can't afford to buy anything there, not even the champagne. But I love watching the people that are there. And women's handbags cost more than my car. So it's a fun thing to go to. But I have only pleasant, positive memories and emotions coming to Maastricht. So I'm glad to be here. Now, I promise you, I will not take more than half of the time tonight to put some things out, because I really prefer to save as much time as possible for your questions, for your challenges, your pushback. I want it to be worth your time coming out here. Okay, so that's what my commitment to you. I also owe you the courtesy of being completely honest and candid about what I think, what I see, to include about my own country, and then when we have Q&A, I may not be right, but I'll be honest. Okay. I plan to focus on Europe this evening and what Europe must do to defend itself against Russia. But first, I must acknowledge what you already know, that we in the United States are going through challenging time. A lot of the norms have been smashed. We have a government shutdown with no end in sight. In fact, my president does not even seem interested in trying to solve the debate to get the government open again. I think he sees political advantage in the fact that our government is shut down right now. There are concerns about the rule of law and the legal or illegal use of the U.S. military. We have a Congress and a Supreme Court that seem unwilling to provide the traditional checks and balances against the executive branch. And we have economic issues, of course, resulting from administration policies. I'm talking primarily about tariffs. Much more to be seen there. I do not yet know the official national defense strategy of the United States. Each administration puts out their own defense strategy, so I don't know what the current administration plans to say. But based on what we see and what we hear from the administration, I would offer a few observations and then be prepared to address them during question time. The administration's priority seems to be the Western Hemisphere. I'm talking about, obviously, North America, Central America, and South America. Homeland defense against illegal immigration, and also the flow of drugs over our borders, primarily from the south. The administration talks about Canada becoming the 51st state. The Canadians are not excited about that, by the way, just to be clear. And he talks about Greenland, that somehow Greenland should belong to the United States. The Panama Canal. The president believes that Panama Canal should be back under American control. You see, of course, almost every day a report of a strike on a Venezuelan drug boat. Boats that are carrying drugs from Venezuela, presumably towards the United States. Of course, we have concerns here because the administration has not made the legal case. Are these even legal strikes? So we are either in direct violation of the law or really working around the edges of it, and it's not entirely clear. And of course, he has not bothered to explain to the Congress what we're doing. We have more U.S. Navy ships in the Caribbean Sea right now than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the aircraft carrier, the USS Ford, the newest aircraft carrier, is being redeployed from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean. Now, I'm laying all this out because, you're aware of these things, but this is relevant because it affects how we look at Europe, how we look at China as well. And the administration has made it clear, in my view, that the Western Hemisphere is the priority. And that means military, legal emphasis is on the Western Hemispheres. Across Europe, however, there are questions about America's commitment to Europe, to NATO, and to Ukraine specifically. We have about 90,000 troops deployed across Europe. That's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Special Forces, from UK to Turkey, from Finland down to Italy and Greece. 90,000 is not many. That's about how many people could sit in Wembley Stadium. So it's not that many people, but there are a lot, of course, of significant capabilities, particularly air power. I don't know that the number of 90,000 is going to be reduced, but I imagine it will. If Europe is not the priority for the administration, then I would anticipate there will be some reductions in the U.S. presence in Europe. The 90,000 is about half permanent, meaning there are people that are stationed in Germany, for example, in Kaiserslautern or Wiesbaden or Stuttgart, or maybe in UK at one of the air bases, or in Rota, Spain, that are permanent, but about half of them are rotational, meaning they come over from the States for 6 months or 9 months for exercises and so on, and before they go back. So half permanent, half rotational. But there's not much that we have in Europe that is needed in the Pacific. The administration looks at the Pacific region as air and maritime domain, and they see Europe as a predominantly land domain. So if there's a reduction of U.S. presence in Europe, it will not be because something left Germany to go to Guam or the Philippines or Hawaii. It will be because the Army overall is being reduced. And this is traditionally how the United States, I think most armies or most countries do this, to free up money for the Air Force and the Navy, you reduce the size of the Army. And so I think that's probably what we're going to see next year is a reduction overall in the size of the Army in order to pay for increasing the size of the Air Force and the Navy. And that's only possible if you don't see Europe as a priority. The nuclear deterrent in NATO, I don't think it's likely that this would change, that the United States would stop providing a nuclear deterrent for Europe, because European prosperity is important for American prosperity. Europe is our biggest trading partner as a bloc, and so it's in our own interest that Europe is stable and secure. So that means I don't think that the United States would withdraw its nuclear deterrent. Plus, there are hundreds of thousands of Americans that live in Europe, and thousands of American businesses are in Europe. So it's not like we're just going to turn our back on Europe. But the fact is, many countries are starting to wonder, can they still depend on the United States to provide a nuclear deterrent? Of course, you know, I'm sure most of you know, that the Netherlands is a part of the nuclear sharing arrangement, where you have American nuclear weapons here that your Air Force would help deliver those, just like the German Air Force, in case of a nuclear crisis. The fact that some nations are wondering or worrying that the United States might not be a dependable nuclear deterrent is a problem. Number one, it's a problem because then the Russians might make a terrible miscalculation and think that there's not a deterrent. Or other countries start thinking they have to get their own nuclear weapon. Poland, Sweden, other countries have talked about, even in Germany, they have a debate, should we become a nuclear power if we cannot depend on the United States? And I think that would be one of the biggest strategic mistakes by the United States in our history, if we created a situation where other nations felt like now they have to get their own nuclear weapon. I hope that does not come to pass. I don't think it will, but of course I can't be sure. What about our commitment to Ukraine? I don't know. The last administration, the Biden administration, of course, clearly supported Ukraine, although there's a lot that they did not do. There's a lot that they did wrong. The Biden administration never said we want Ukraine to win. There never was a clearly defined end state. Why are we there? They said we're with Ukraine for as long as it takes, which means absolutely zero, but I never worried that the Biden administration would not support Ukraine. The Trump administration, I am much more uneasy, even though most of the Congress supports Ukraine and most Americans support Ukraine. The administration has taken us on a roller coaster, if you will, of emotions and trying to figure out what direction they want to go. And so you can imagine, if we don't know, the Ukrainians don't know, others don't know, and the Russians don't know. I do think that the president is sincere when he says he wants to end the killing in Ukraine. I think he's sincere when he says that he really does want to see peace there. The problem is he has not been willing to do what's necessary to achieve that in a lasting way. I believe the administration's approach has been doomed to failure from the start. They have never understood or even cared about the origin of the conflict, the causes of the war, the geography, or the history. He won't even say that Russia is the aggressor, and he has never told President Putin, get your troops out of Ukraine. Instead, they talk about Ukraine needing to give up land for the sake of peace. But these are not Manhattan real estate negotiations. President Zelensky reminds us that about 4 million Ukrainian citizens live in those occupied parts of Ukraine that the president has pushed the Ukrainians to give up. And obviously President Zelensky is not going to do that. He can't do that politically. My hope has always been that President Putin would overreach, that he would do something that would finally make President Trump so angry that President Trump would do something significant, that he would use the enormous leverage that he has, economic tools, diplomatic tools, aid for Ukraine. These are all things that the American president could do. but he's been hesitant to do it for whatever reason, and I don't fully understand it. But it does seem like now that President Putin has finally crossed that line somewhere, when he made it clear just the other day after this famous phone call, and they had planned to meet in Budapest, and then Foreign Minister Lavrov says, no changes to our objective, the same maximalist objectives and demands from the Russian side. And I think that finally, President Trump has finally realized what everybody in this room already knew, was that the Russians had zero respect for him and that they were playing him. And I think he finally said, that's enough. So now, and of course, I've been disappointed several times over the last few months already, so I don't get my hopes up too high. I still am a skeptic about whether or not the Trump administration is actually going to do anything. But the sanctions that were announced just a couple of days ago, if they are enforced, and if we follow through on this, that could be something that's a little bit more significant than what he's done in the past. He has apparently also agreed to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons inside Russia that he had not allowed before. So these are positive developments. The thing, of course, that's still missing is for what? What is the objective? What is the strategic end state of what our policy is supposed to achieve, of what Europe's policies are supposed to achieve? That's still not clear. China. Of course, my president is meeting with President Xi, I think, on Thursday. He's in the Pacific right now he's in Japan today, and he's hitting several countries, and there are Asia-Pacific meetings this week, but he's meeting specifically with President Xi on Thursday. So I think I'll know a lot more at the end of this week than I do right now, but I don't hear as much talk anymore about China as a military threat. Not because they're no longer a threat, but because I don't think the administration sees them in the same priority that they used to. And this goes back to my belief that the priority is Western Hemisphere. Now, if this is because he doesn't think it's important, or maybe we are at a place now with our military that we're no longer certain that we could defeat China if there was a conflict. I'd never thought about that before until recently, that perhaps the priority is changing because we don't have a choice. And we don't have allies that can fill all the gaps. So I'm not sure. But if I'm Taiwan or Japan or South Korea right now or the Philippines, I'm a little uneasy. When the president in his approach towards Ukraine is, come on, let them have Crimea, give up the land to the Russians. They speak Russian there anyway. What the Chinese are hearing is lack of will, and also that maybe the U.S. is a little bit flexible on this sovereignty thing. So these are bad signals, I think, that we're sending. Now, I want to see Ukraine defeat Russia. I mean, crush them. Drive them back to where they live inside their own border. It's entirely possible, and I'll come to that in a second. But I want you to, as you're listening to me and you kind of know where I stand, I'm not advocating for regime change of Russia, but we should prepare for it. I've met one person in the last 10 years that predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse when it did. All of us, I believe, were caught by surprise. We were not prepared. Thankfully, millions of people became free as a result of it, but we also ended up with a terrible situation in Russia that got us to where we are now. I think if we were thinking strategically, we should anticipate. What are the possibilities? What happens if the Putin regime does collapse somehow? We will come to that later. So the possibility of American failure to lead within NATO and our reluctance to make it clear that we will defend Europe, this is a very real possibility. Now, I'm an optimist at heart. My mother made me that way. So I want to believe that we're not going to turn our back on the place where all of our best allies are and where we have so many strategic interests. But if Europeans don't think about this as a real possibility, then you'll never take the steps needed to protect yourself. So that's what I want to cause you to think reflectively, or to reflect on the very real possibility that you might not have the United States in the traditional sense. This means that Europeans will have to fill capability gaps themselves to a level which would effectively deter Russia. This will require not only increased military capabilities, but also increased cooperation between NATO and the European Union, since much of what is needed to deter Russia will be not only military strength, but also economic, industrial, logistical, and legal enforcement capabilities. Can Europe defend itself without the U.S.? Of course you can. Absolutely, of course you can. Taken together, the combined economies, militaries, defense industries, wealth, technology, populations of the UK, Norway, the European Union, and I would add Canada, dwarfs that of Russia. I mean, like 15-1. So why does Europe lack self-confidence? Why is Europe so intimidated by what Russia might do instead of leveraging your own advantages to make Russia scared of provoking you? Why is that? What's lacking, of course, is the political will to acknowledge that Russia is a threat and to act with the necessary sense of urgency to address that threat. We know from centuries of history that the best way to prevent war is to demonstrate that you are prepared for it. To do otherwise invites aggression, and that's what we're experiencing right now. It seems to me that Russia has adopted a two-pronged strategy, a war of devastation against those parts of Ukraine it cannot conquer, and a war of coercion against free Europe. Here's an excerpt from a recent edition of The Economist. Quote, drones over Poland, Russian Air Force flying through Estonian airspace, undersea infrastructure destroyed, airports shut down in Denmark and Munich due to drones, constant disinformation intended to undermine our elections. None of these are, by themselves, justification for a war. But taken together, they represent something new and dangerous. Vladimir Putin is waging a Greyzone campaign against NATO, a cheap, deniable, and calibrated effort to unsettle Europe, which is just below outright conflict. End quote. Here's my current assessment of the war in Ukraine. And here's a warning. Some of you who know me know that I am an eternal optimist, so feel free to take my analysis with a grain of salt. But I believe in the aphorism that war is a test of will, and Ukrainians clearly have superior will to Russia. The question is, do our political leaders have superior will to Vladimir Putin? Overall, the tide seems to have turned slightly in Ukraine's favor. Even President Trump, just a few weeks ago, seemed to have changed his perception of who was winning or losing and who actually had the cards. Of course, his assessment and mood have changed several times since then. We can explore that a little bit further during Q&A as well. This does not mean that Ukraine is about to win or that Russia is about to lose. Indeed, this war will continue as long as Putin remains in power and is convinced that he cannot win. But it is clear that at this point in the war, Russia cannot overwhelm or break through Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainians have repeatedly stopped Russian advances all along the front, with minor Russian gains coming at enormous costs in Russian casualties. Remember, this war started 11 and a half years ago, not 3.5, 11 and a half in 2014. And in 11 and a half years, the great Russian Black Sea Fleet, which has a really cool name, but is not a very good navy, it no longer is a factor. It was defeated by Ukraine, which does not even have a navy in the traditional sense. The Russian Air Force, which had every advantage at the start of this war, has failed the two main tasks that any Air Force is required to achieve. Air superiority, they failed to do that. Russian airplanes do not fly over Ukraine. And they failed to interdict the lines of communication that bring ammunition and equipment from Poland into Ukraine. So the Navy, the Air Force have failed. And in 11 and a half years, after over 1 million casualties, Russia controls about 20% of Ukraine. And that's not going to change unless something dramatically different happens externally. So I anticipate that Vladimir Putin will continue going after civilian targets and hoping that the West will finally quit before his own economy fails. Ukraine knows that it has stopped Russia. In parallel, it has significantly increased its own defense industry output while at war. About 40% of what Ukrainian armed forces are using today is actually manufactured in Ukraine. This includes long-range precision strike capabilities, drones, and their new Flamingo cruise missile, which are steadily hammering Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, which is down by about 38% by now. While problems remain, especially in terms of manpower, we don't hear as much about ammunition shortages anymore. So in other words, we're sort of at a stalemate in Ukraine. And I think a year from today, it'll look a lot like it does right now, unless there is a significant increase in help from the West or if we quit. So back to my question. Can Europe defend itself without strong, reliable American support? This will no longer be a theoretical question if Ukraine fails. But Ukraine only fails if we fail to support them and take the necessary steps to build up our deterrence. That's an enormous if. If we fail and Ukraine fails, the Red Army will absorb tens of thousands of trained Ukrainian soldiers and their equipment, which will be forced into Russian army formations. Millions more Ukrainian refugees will head to Central and Western Europe. And Russia will feel emboldened to expand the war to Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, where Dutch soldiers are stationed today, and perhaps even Poland. And China will take note of our lack of will to stop a weakened Russia and our apparent flexibility on the principle of sovereignty. The sooner that we recognize that Russia is waging war against us and act accordingly, the better are our chances for preventing an actual kinetic conflict. So what needs to be done? And this is where you could take out your pen, because I'm going to give you about 5 things that you have to do, okay, or make sure your government does. Number 1, change the culture within our societies. Our political leaders must speak to us as if we are adults and explain what is at stake and explain the price for failure. They must acknowledge that Russia is at war with us, even if we wish it were not so. Number 2, make sure that Ukraine defeats Russia and forces Russia to live within its own borders. That is the best way to defend Europe, and it would not cost the life of a single Dutch soldier. Ukraine is not asking for our soldiers. They just need the tools to defeat Russia, and that's what we should be providing to them. Now, there is recent good news on this front. I'm sure many of you saw that Sweden has agreed to sell over 100 Gripen fighter aircraft to Ukraine, and they just announced today that they're going to set up a factory to help build Gripens inside Ukraine. Germany has long been the number 2 provider of equipment and support to Ukraine, and they have factories operating inside Ukraine already, as does UK. Number 3, wreck Russia's oil and gas export industry. The Russians are only able to stay in this war by selling oil and gas to China, India, Turkey, and some other customers. 1/3 of Russia's state finances come from the export of oil, 1/3. So if we help Ukraine wreck their oil and gas industry, then it's over. We can do this by contributing more of our own long-range precision strike capability to Ukraine on top of what they already are using. We should also invest in Ukraine's defense industry so that they can scale up what they are already doing. Sure, many of you may be aware or recall that Ukraine was always the heart of the Soviet Union's defense industry. So there is a residual technical and engineering expertise there in Ukraine, which is part of the reason they've been so successful at developing and integrating new technologies, but they're not yet able to get to the scale necessary to dominate Russia. So this is where we could be investing. And then finally, we should take steps to stop or disrupt the Russian shadow fleet vessels which are passing through the Baltic Sea every day, carrying Russia's oil to its customers. About 3 per day of these old vessels carrying Russian oil going out through the Danish Straits. Now, I met the European Commission Special Envoy for Sanctions, Mr. O'Sullivan, at a conference last year, and he referred to all of these shadow fleet vessels as end-of-life vessels. I would not want to be a sailor on an end-of-life vessel, but what that means for us is that these ships are environmental disasters waiting to happen. And so here's an area where I think nations are going to be reluctant to go out and just grab these ships because they don't want to have Russia get mad at them. And it's like, well, it's international water, but you do have the authority to stop vessels to make sure that they don't become an environmental disaster. You board it and you inspect, just the way the police would stop you on the street, perhaps on a Saturday night. Let me see the papers, your insurance, safety inspection, and I would predict about 90% of these ships would fail all of those inspections. So we're not using the tools that we have to disrupt or stop the flow of this oil, which is what keeps Russia in the war. Number 4, we have to focus on improving the readiness of our own armed forces. And that's not just about new equipment. It's about making sure that all of the formations, ships, and planes are properly manned and that they're trained to create a force that is prepared to fight tonight, what the Germans call kriegstüchtig, ready for war. German political and military leaders use this phrase openly now. Can you imagine, even 2 years ago in Germany, a politician or the chief of defense talking about we have to be kriegstüchtig? It's a significant change in the culture in Germany. And by the way, I was just looking at their priority list today, 377 billion euro that they're going to spend on new equipment. over the next 10 years. Number 5, ramp up our own defense industry to get it on a war footing. I hear a lot of talk about this, but we are nowhere near where we need to be. Industry has to be willing to take risks also, but the government must knock down the barriers that are out of date and which limit innovation and rapid expansion. Many people are saying the right things. President of the European Commission, Dr. Ursula von der Leyen, said, quote, "Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. This is a moment for Europe. We are ready to step up." UK Defense Secretary John Healey recently said, quote, "We have to get more technology in the hands of our frontline forces, and we have to be capable of upgrading and innovating at a wartime pace if we want to give our soldiers the edge over adversaries." German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said, quote, "Industry needs to ramp up its capacities. That applies to ammunition, to drones, to tanks, really to everything." And then the CEO at Thales, Patrice Cain, said, quote, "Europe has the technology to assure its own defense, but its ability to fill any gaps left by transatlantic tensions will depend on the extent to which political declarations turn into firm defense orders." So, can Europe defend itself? I believe yes. But the answer will come from our elected civilian leaders and from our societies to change perceptions about the threat and about social responsibility for defense and security. Thanks for your attention, or as President Trump says, thanks for your attention to this matter. I look forward to your questions.